So, Sam, just tell us a little bit about where you come from. What do you do with yourself normally?
Yep. I come from England, so my August weather is very similar to your August weather. I've been feeling very at home in your drizzle. So I'm based in the UK. I live near Windsor, so I have the Queen in my neighbourhood. That's probably the only interesting fact I can think of about where I live. And I work for a Christian ministry that tries to think about the biggest questions people have about life and to try to come up with compelling answers as far as we can.
Called?
The organisation is called Ravi Zacharias Ministries. We've got a couple of guys who work based in Australia as well. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Terrific. Can you tell us, what are you doing here in Adelaide besides speaking tonight?
Well, tonight I'm having schnitzel. Apparently that's what you do when you're in South Australia, is it? I was going to have a salad. This is unlike me to order a salad. I thought I'm going to try to be healthy, and I was rebuked.
You thought it was summer.
I did. So, but I gather when you're in South Australia, you have schnitzel. So I'm eating schnitzel. I'm here in Adelaide for a week, speaking at a few different events, and next week I'm off to
Sydney.
Sydney. That's
Yeah.
the one. To meet the bruisers up there.
Okay.
What is it you call it? The coat hangers or something? What's the nickname you
I
guys
don't
have?
think
for
I said any of those words.
it? Okay. Anyway.
If you're from Sydney here tonight, welcome. Can you tell, what are you going to do while you're here, besides lots of workshops on this?
Well, I'm hoping to see the coast a bit. Apparently you have one. So I thought I'd get over to that. I enjoy hiking and fresh air. And so I hear if I go to the coast and turn left, eventually I'll get to some nice cliffs and some nice hikes and that kind of thing. So
Terrific.
that's what someone's told me anyway. So we'll see what happens. If you hear about an Englishman going missing, you'll know what happened.
Can you tell us how did you end up talking about this subject? Because you're doing this here, Sydney, you're going to the US to speak about it. How did you end up talking about this?
Yeah, not by design is the short answer. I've been a pastor for a number of years, so I'm used to kind of speaking to certain issues from a Christian perspective and trying to, I guess, commend a Christian viewpoint in different areas. But with this issue, it's much more personal to me. I guess for most of us, when we think about issues of sexuality, we're probably having in mind people that we know who are close to us, who would self-identify as LGBT or same-sex attracted. Most of us these days have someone in our orbit for whom that would be the case. So for most of us, it isn't an academic issue. It's about people that we know. But for me, it goes a step closer because this has been part of my own kind of lived experience over the years.
So with your own story, what was it like sort of coming to that realisation that you were gay?
Well, it took a long time. I'm slow at the best of times anyway. And I was, you'll struggle to believe this, but I was a teenager 25 years ago. And obviously it was a very different world then. These issues weren't on the radar to the extent that they are now. And so it took me a long time to figure out that not liking girls in that way, but liking guys in that way was actually being gay. It took a while for the penny to drop, but I remember.
How old were you?
Well, I think when it first kind of made sense, I was 17.
Okay.
I remember. I don't know why this revelation happened at a bus stop, but I was travelling back home from high school. I was waiting for the bus, and I just remember standing at the bus stop and thinking, I think I'm gay. I think that's what this is. And I was thinking, yeah, that's clearly what this is. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment because I kind of hadn't really understood the feelings that I was having and what that might have meant.
Okay. And from what we talked about this morning, you weren't a Christian at that stage. So
Yeah.
when did becoming a Christian come into this? How did that happen?
Well, actually, not long after the bus stop.
Okay. Someone was waiting at the bus stop?
Yeah. As I was having that little private revelation at the bus stop, I then started to think, I was applying for university, so I remember thinking at that time, this could be something I explore at uni. Most of us in the UK, when we go to uni, we end up going somewhere not where we live, so we study somewhere else. So I remember thinking, this could be something I run with at university, and then no one at home would need to know. Because at that time there was no kind of, people weren't quite as receptive to that sort of lifestyle in the way that we're used to today. And again, this is going to age me catastrophically, but this was before the internet, if we can remember those dark days. And so I remember thinking, you could lead a double life quite easily. You weren't Instagramming every waking moment and posting it online and that kind of thing. But between the bus stop and arriving at university, a Christian friend invited me to their church's youth ministry. And the very first time I heard her talk about the Christian faith, I realized that my image of Christianity had been quite far from the reality. And I remember distinctively hearing for the first time in my life that Christianity wasn't about God rewarding good people, it was about God forgiving bad people. Mm-hmm. And I realized I'd never heard that in my life. And I started going week by week and began to realize I was the sort of person God had come to forgive in Christ.
Okay. Did it have a layer of complexity, becoming a Christian, for you when you knew you were gay?
Well, in a funny way, not really, no. So I began to grasp who Jesus was and felt very drawn to him. And when I understood that he had died for me and what that involved and what that meant, I remember thinking, this is someone I can follow. Mm-hmm. This is someone I want to give my life to. And it was only after that I thought, I wonder what Jesus thinks about homosexuality. But I didn't, there wasn't angst about that, because I felt like I knew Jesus well enough that whatever he thought would be okay. And I had no idea what he would think. No idea at all. But I just thought, whatever he says will be right for me.
Okay.
And so in one sense, it was a big issue to then navigate. But in another sense, it didn't feel, at the time, it didn't feel like a big deal.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, it is lovely to be with you. I've had a chance to meet a few of you this evening already. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for your care about this issue. I presume we are here this evening because we do care about this issue. It matters to us. It matters to us because people matter to us. And it matters to us because I guess in our own day and age, and you will know this, I'm sure more than I will, we don't get a choice about whether or not we think about this issue, right? We don't get a choice about whether we think about it. We don't get a choice about actually whether we speak about it as believers. It is such a massive issue in our culture at the moment. It is something people are so deeply concerned about and passionate for that there's no way we can kind of think, well, I'm just going to avoid this one as a Christian and keep my head in the sand and not engage with it. I'm sure your experience in your context and workplaces is the same as my experience in my own neighborhood with my extended family and all the rest of it. People want to know what we think. And so we do have to engage with this and try and give an account of what we believe as Christians. In my interactions with folks back home, and I'm presuming folks back home where I come from are not massively different to folks here in Adelaide. A little bit more sophisticated perhaps, but I'm using shorter words for you just to kind of... Anyway, you can write anything you want on those pieces of paper, by the way, so you can vent your spleen there if I'm offending you. But certainly in my experience back in the UK, I'm the only Christian believer in my family and in my extended family. I think I'm the only believer on my street from the neighbours I've had interaction with. Working for a Christian organisation, I'm happy to say I'm not the only Christian believer in my workplace. But it does mean I do spend a good deal of time interacting with people from different backgrounds, of different faiths and none. And so I get a feel for the kinds of issues people have around issues of sexuality. And my experience will be the same as your experience, which is when people are thinking about issues of sexuality and they find out we're a Christian, often the default response is one of maybe suspicion. In some cases with LGBT friends of mine, their initial reaction when they find out I'm not just a Christian but a pastor actually is fear. And it's, in one sense, it sounds absurd because no one has ever been afraid of me in my entire life. It's almost a compliment if someone feels like they are afraid of me. But it's heartbreaking because actually what we want to be about as Christians is that, you know, fear should be the last response someone should have to someone who represents Jesus Christ. We represent the most loving man who ever lived. A God who is gracious and truthful and kind. And so it is heartbreaking when people hear we're Christians and their immediate reaction is, I'm now worried about you. And in my experience, there are three particular ways in which people assume we're not going to be good news when it comes to LGBT type issues. In my experience, people think that our message is unloving, they think it is unjust, and they think it is unhealthy. When I started to kind of look into these matters as a very new believer, I wanted to know what Jesus thought about this issue, and I didn't know anything about the Bible at that stage. I didn't know that I was supposed to read Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6 and those types of passages. I just dove into the Gospels and thought, well, let's see if anything Jesus says kind of hits on this issue. So I kind of came at it from a slightly different angle to, I guess, many people when they're looking at this. But two particular passages stood out to me. One is in Matthew 15, and it's verses 19 and 20, if you want to look it up a bit later on. And it's just a passing reference. It's almost a kind of drive-by incident where Jesus is talking about the nature of sin and how it's inside of us. He was talking to people who thought sin was outside and you just had to avoid it. And he says, no, it's in your heart. And he says one of the symptoms of the fact that we're not naturally right with God in our hearts is that we commit what he calls sexual immorality. And when I kind of sniffed around that phrase to find out what it meant, and in the original, actually I don't normally know Greek words, but I know this one, and you'll quickly figure out why. The Greek word for sexual immorality in Matthew's Gospel is porneia. Okay, that sounds a bit familiar, but it's because it's where we get the word pornography from. And it simply meant at that time any sexual behavior outside of marriage, of any kind. And so I thought, okay, so Jesus says sex outside of marriage is wrong. And again, at that stage, I was thinking, if that's what Jesus thinks, I'm fine with that. The next passage I came to that was going to be very significant is Matthew 19. It's a very significant passage on these kinds of issues because Jesus is having a conversation with some people about marriage and divorce. And in order to answer their question about divorce, he has to tell them what marriage is and something of what marriage means. And so he does two quick things. He talks about Genesis 1, and then he talks about Genesis 2. And in Genesis 1, Jesus refers to the fact that in Genesis 1, we're made male and female, and then he connects that to the observation in Genesis 2 that people marry. And so I could see a connection there that was going to be very significant. Jesus says it's because God has made us as male and female that we have this thing called marriage. So as far as he's concerned, in Matthew 19, it's verses 3 to 6, if you want to look it up and check it out yourselves. As far as Jesus is concerned, marriage is predicated on the fact that we are sexually different as male and female. And so I quickly put those two passages together in my head and thought, okay, Jesus says sex outside of marriage is is not right. That's not going to be right for me if I'm following him. And he says marriage is between a man and a woman. So for me, that kind of settled the issue, and I then started to come across other passages that seem to confirm that as well. But it means that for me, the fundamental determining issue in how I think about this as a Christian isn't whether Paul knew about the same kind of gay couples that we know today, or whether that Greek word in Corinthians means this or that. Actually, the issue for me wasn't what Paul said and knew about homosexuality. The issue for me was what Jesus said about marriage. That for me is what is determining of this issue. So that's how I kind of came to my convictions as a Christian. So let me just try and answer each of those three kind of objections to that Christian position. The first is that it's seen to be unloving, because the implication is that if you are gay, if you're someone who is not likely to have romantic and sexual feelings for someone of the opposite sex, you're not likely to get married. And so for many of us who would say we're same-sex attracted, for many of us we're thinking about long-term singleness. And in our culture, that's not seen as a good option. I've had conversations with LGBT friends who've said to me things like, but yes, you have to live a life without love. Or they even use the language of you are doomed to singleness. It feels so unloving. It feels like you're kind of living a shriveled kind of existence and depriving yourself of things that should be fundamental to how we live as human beings. And so what I want to try to show people actually is that the Bible gives us a much broader way than our culture does of how we can experience intimacy and love. In our culture, I'm just going to keep an eye on when my food is arriving. In our culture, we've really collapsed sex and intimacy into each other, to the point we can't conceive of any real intimacy that isn't ultimately sexual in nature. But what you see as you study the Bible, and actually just observation as well, shows us that it's possible to have a lot of sex and no intimacy. And it's actually possible to have a lot of intimacy that is non-sexual. In the Bible, friendship is something that is spoken of in very high regard. One of the things I learned just this week is that that one of the main Hebrew word for friend, and again, I don't tend to memorize Hebrew words, but you'll realize why this one sticks in your mind. The Hebrew for friend is sod. I don't know if sod has the same connotations here that it has back in England. But the other meaning of that same word is secret. Because in Hebrew thought, a friend is someone you tell your secrets to. It's a very intimate thing. And so in the Bible, friendship is not just mateship, the guys you hang out with or watch a match with or whatever you might do. Actually, it is something that is a soul-to-soul relationship. And so part of what I want to try and share with my friends that actually is there's a depth of intimacy I may not experience by not being married, but there is a breadth of intimacy that I'm able to have as a single person that I wouldn't be able to have if I was married. I can invest in a range of friendships I wouldn't otherwise be able to develop. And as Christian communities, we need to model that. We need to make sure that in our churches and our fellowships, actually we are modeling the kinds of friendships that demonstrate that you don't need to be married to have intimacy. So I want to say it's not unloving. We've actually got a very narrow view of love in our culture at the moment. Secondly, it's not unfair. It's not unjust. And the reason for that is because the gospel always puts us in the same boat, whoever we are. The message of Christianity is not that gay people have a problem with their sexuality. the message of Christianity is that everyone has a problem with their sexuality. The Christian view of sin is such that it touches every area of life. And so when it comes to sexuality, all of us are a bit broken. All of us are fallen. All of us have disordered desires. If I can put it this way, there's no one who's straight. Actually, all of us are a bit skewed one way or the other. And therefore, the teaching of Jesus on sexual ethics is going to be challenging for all of us, because all of us are going to have to say no to certain sexual desires. And so I began to realize actually that the gospel wasn't singling me out for special treatment. Actually, the gospel was saying that all of us are the same. And it's worth us in our interactions on this issue. One of the kind of principles I now try and operate under when I'm particularly talking about LGBT issues is I don't say to someone what I can't say to everyone. I don't say to someone what I can't say to everyone. Because what I'm trying to show is actually Jesus treats us all the same. And so as happened recently, a lady came up to me after a talk I'd given and said, "I'm a lesbian, what do you think about that?" I thought, I'm not going to say to you what I can't say to everyone else. So I said, well, actually, Jesus has very challenging things to say to all of us about our sexuality, and explain what that was and why that was and what that meant. Because I'm trying to show her actually Jesus treats us the same. There's actually an equality with the gospel that we don't have in our secular culture. So I wouldn't want to say that the gospel is unfair. Actually, we're in the same boat. Fundamentally, we are the same. And then the final thing is this accusation that the Christian message on sexuality is unhealthy. And again, I want to gently challenge that with my friends and say, well, our culture says you are your sexuality. That your sexuality, whatever it is, whatever desires and proclivities you may happen to have, those desires define you. They are you at your most you. They are you at your deepest level. And I want to suggest that is actually very, very bad news. Because if you are your sexuality, then you cannot live a healthy, fulfilled, complete life unless you are fulfilling your sexual desires. That is obviously bad news for those who feel like they're not fulfilling their sexual desires, because it's saying to them, in effect, the best in life is passing you by. And I've got to say, there is a death toll that comes with that kind of thinking. There are so many people today who have been taught to think that a life without sexual fulfillment is not worth living. But it's also bad news for those who feel like they are sexually fulfilled, because it says to them, this is as good as life gets. This is life to the full. And I've met so many people who are having the kind of sex they want to have with the kind of people they're wanting to have it with, and they're not feeling as though life is now complete. There's still an emptiness. There's still a yearning, a deeper longing that is not being met by this. And so I think actually the danger and the unhealthiness is the extent to which we've elevated sexual feelings and made them the be-all and end-all, virtually the meaning of life for many people. That doesn't do good things to us. That's a bad anthropology. Where we will find completion and fullness is not in any particular kind of romantic relationship or sexual partnership. Actually, it's in knowing the God who made us. Given you're about to eat food, this is what I want you to think about when you eat food. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. And for Jesus at his time, bread was food. Food was bread. If you didn't have bread, you didn't eat. So Jesus is saying that he is to your soul what the food you're about to eat is to your hungry tummy. And therefore we will only ultimately find satisfaction and fulfillment and a sense of completion if we know him.
Okay, well, let's get down to some serious questions. Great questions, by the way, from people. So I won't do them in any particular order. Well, there was one that I wanted to start with. Right, I've lost that question. But the question was, how did you... That's a really good question to kick off with.
You're a real pro.
Yeah, I know. Oh, here we go. How long did you wait to tell your friends and family that you were same-sex attracted? Was that easy or hard?
I waited a long time, and I waited too long. And the reason I waited so long was because I thought you're not supposed to have these feelings if you're a Christian. And I worried that being open about those feelings might put a distance between me and my Christian friends. I was worried how people would react to it. I needn't have worried, as it turns out, because actually it was a really positive experience to open up. It actually, rather than pushing friendships away, it actually made good friendships even deeper. Telling family was a bit awkward. I think.
Why was it awkward?
Well, just I think any conversation with your own parents about your sexual feelings is going to be a bit, you know.
Yes. Yes.
And also with my family not being believers, I was not only disclosing something very personal and wasn't entirely sure how they would react, but I was then adding another layer of complication by saying, and I'm not doing with this what is expected of me in our culture today.
Right.
So I kind of had to explain my sexuality and then why I was committed to being celibate.
Okay.
So it's just a lot
How did they go with that?
They were delightful. I mean, they've always been, we want to support you, whatever you're doing in life and whatever makes you happy. So their initial reaction was, we want you to have someone.
Yes.
And so they were worried that I might be on my own.
Yep.
But I think that was a good... It was over 10 years ago now that I told them, and I think they see enough of my life, they know enough of my friends, that they know I'm not living a life of isolation.
Okay. All right.
Which is good.
Well, let's move on to a couple of other ones. I understand what you say about how the gospel treats us all the same, i.e. it's not unfair. But how do you explain that to a not yet Christian, I'd say, the person said non-Christian, but not yet Christian, who thinks it is unfair?
I think what I would try, I didn't have time to go into lots of detail on that point, but I think the point I would want to make is that for every single one of us, there is going to be enormous cost to following Jesus. What that cost will look like will vary from person to person. But Jesus says in Mark 8 that if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And we're so familiar with those words as Christians that we miss the force of what they're saying. We tend to use the language today of are you affirming or non-affirming, right? When it comes to LGBT issues, you use that language? Have you heard that language? So if your church is affirming, that means you agree with gay marriage. If you're non-affirming, you don't agree with gay marriage. In Mark 8, Jesus shows us he is non-affirming of all of us. Because he says of each of us that our self is something we need to say a profound no to. And actually one of the things we then realize as Christians is that as we deny self, we become ourselves. We become the people God made us to be. But it means that for each one of us, there are going to be cherished ambitions. There are going to be patterns of relationship, patterns of thinking. There's going to be aspects of our identity that we're going to have to give over to Jesus. And so for each one of us, Jesus is going to ask us to turn our lives upside down. So whilst the application of that will vary from person to person, actually the same process is going on with all of us. So person A, following Jesus, if they're in my situation, won't be able to fulfill their sexual feelings. Person B, if they're heterosexual, might to some extent, if they're able to marry and are godly within that marriage. So that, just on that axis, it looks a bit unfair. But then actually, I've forgotten which was A and which was B now, but the person who's now married, say, is still going to have to give up to Jesus some of the most fundamental and cherished ways that they had thought about their life. For all of us, life had been about us and what I want to do, what I dream of doing, and now it's about Christ. And so actually, behaviorally that will vary, but at the deepest level, it's the same deal for all of us. There's the same cost, and there's the same blessing. So I wouldn't want us to see the difference in detail and to make more of that when actually under the surface that it's the same thing. Does that make sense? And I think one of the issues one of the reasons we struggle with this issue so much in the kind of Christian world today is because at some point we dropped the cost of discipleship from our thinking. And so when we see it applying to gay friends, it suddenly looks very severe and harsh and demanding. And so one of the things I try to say to people is, if you think the cost of discipleship is too high for gay people, you think the cost of discipleship is too high for anyone. Because Jesus he wants the whole of our lives for all of us.
It probably comes back to culture really valuing to the extreme individualism and rights these days. There's a very good article on that, by the way, if you want to look it up, by Paul Kelly from The Australian from about 2.5-3 weeks ago in the Australian Weekend on blessed are the egoistic individuals. And that would play right into what you were just talking about, I think. Okay. Do you think people are genetically born gay?
That's an easy one because I don't know. And in one sense, it doesn't really make much difference because I don't track the science of this on a daily basis, but I've not heard that they've discovered a gay gene. It's not inconceivable that they might, but it doesn't. For me, it doesn't change anything because my understanding of the gospel tells me that all of us were not born right the first time anyway. That's why Jesus said that thing to Nicodemus in John 3 where he said, you must be born again. And that's become such a kind of familiar bit of Christian jargon. Again, we miss how screamingly offensive that is. I have an unfortunate habit of when people show me their newborn baby, I tend to say the wrong thing. One couple at church came up to me and showed me their little bundle of baby, and I said, "Oh, he's lovely. What's his name?" And they said Rebecca. And then they said, "We dressed her in pink just to help you." And I was like,
What you've got to say...
Yeah, I didn't notice that.
What you've got to say is, if you're not sure, you just go, "Oh, that's a baby." It works every time and it gets you out of everything.
Thank you. But here's the thing. Imagine someone comes up to me with their newborn baby, flushed with parental pride, and I look at that baby and say, I think your baby needs to be born again. You can feel how offensive that is. That's what Jesus says to all of us. So in other words, that means all of us are born with certain tendencies and certain proclivities that are not right. So if they discover that homosexuality is one of those genetic wired things, that doesn't change the morality of it because there are so many other ways in which what feels natural and innate to me is not wrong. I'm naturally very irritable. I may well have been born irritable. I think I looked and sounded irritable when I appeared anyway. But I can't therefore say, well, God made me irritable, and therefore you have to affirm my irritability because I was born that way. The gospel says to all of us that we weren't born the right way the first time. That's why we need to be born again.
Question very similar to the one we had before. So I won't pose this one, but when people couch gay marriage in terms of a human right, it's very difficult to counter that. I think we've already heard about talking about rights, Christ's lordship. I think.
Yeah, I think I would add to that in one sense we're not denying anyone the right to marry. We're just saying we don't think we should change the definition of marriage. Everyone is legally able to get married. What they're saying is not that they have a right to get married, but that they have a right to call a particular type of relationship a marriage. So no one is being denied the relationship of their choice. The issue is over what is the appropriate label for that particular relationship. So often the question is slightly disingenuous, I think. And I think we want to add to that right. Do you think I know this is controversial, I wouldn't necessarily say this every time I was in a conversation with someone, but at some point I might say, well, do you think a child has a right to a mum and dad? Because it's not just the rights of two consenting adults that are in play here. That what we do with these relationships ends up affecting lots of other people too. And so we need to think, well, okay, if you have your right there, whose other rights are you affecting? And how do we measure whose rights count the most? So it's not as simple to say as you're withholding a right to marriage and that's unjust.
So that's the whole thing about being in a community and where individuals and their rights fit into
Actually, today, the airline KLM gave us a very good illustration of this. If you go on Twitter, KLM are trying to promote Amsterdam Pride, and they goofed up spectacularly because they posted a picture of 3 airplane seatbelts, each with rainbow straps. One was 2 sockets, one was 2 bits that you insert, and then the third one was a socket and a bit you insert. And the caption was, it doesn't make any difference what makes you click. Where the actual picture is making the opposite point. Because only one of those 3 options does click. And here's the point, KLM only has one of those combinations on its aircraft seats. And the reason for that is because only one of those relationships, only one of those combinations is a public good. So they've actually, I don't know if someone in their marketing department is actually an undercover Christian or quite what's going on there, but the point they're making actually inadvertently goes against what they're saying, because there is something intrinsic to the male-female complementarity that makes marriage, male-female marriage, a public good. It's something that actually the whole of society has a stake in, which is one of the reasons why in the Bible it is the male-female relationship that is uniquely a one-flesh relationship. It's the relationship that is designed to be the one in which children are raised. And so if you want to have some fun with KLM, go and look that up.
Can you tell us question here, how can we get along with LGBTI friends?
Yeah, I hope the answer would be with how we get along with anyone, by being a good friend. I think sometimes one of the mistakes Christians make is we meet someone from the LGBT community and we think, I've got to go into preachy mode, and to be a faithful Christian I have to explain everything I think about homosexuality by Tuesday, otherwise I've not been a proper Christian. And we don't do that with most people we meet. You don't meet someone and they say, hi, I'm a bus driver, or I'm living with my boyfriend, and then we think, right, I've got to say everything I believe about that right now. Actually, one of the ways we demonstrate friendship is taking a genuine interest in others. One of the ways we do that is by being good listeners. And so if I meet someone who's LGBTI or whatever it might be, and they're happy to talk about that, I'm really happy to hear about it, because I'd love to know if they're comfortable sharing. I'd love to know what their journey has been, how they are, what have the ups and downs been. And the more we listen, I'm convinced of this, the more we listen, the more further down the road they will take an interest in us. But we have to earn the right to say what we think. And I think it's only when people know that we are for them, that we're genuinely interested with them, we're not just seeing them as a kind of potential evangelistic scalp. It's only when they feel that there's that genuine love and interest that they'll want to know what we think, and they'll feel a whole lot safer hearing what we think when we've already convinced them that we love them.
Question that's not here, but one that's been voiced to me often is, what about the behaviour of the church in past decades towards homosexuals in particular, just really, really singling out violent, basically running people into the ground.
Yeah, I think we want to be very honest about that and be very clear that that's not on. And that has happened. We mustn't pretend it hasn't. And we need to not only show that it's wrong, but why we think it's wrong, why there are Christian reasons why that is wrong. So we don't just think it's wrong because we want to agree with society. We think it's wrong because the gospel treats us the same. And therefore, if we're all fallen and broken in our sexuality, it's not on to take one type of person and kind of single them out for special kind of condemnation. It's interesting. Jesus never called anybody a freak. And yet so often the way we behave as Christians, the way we try to explain what we think, can leave people feeling as though they're freaks. And if that's how we make someone feel, we're not reflecting the truth of Christianity. So we want to be open that these things have happened, and that they've happened because people weren't being Christian rather than they were being too Christian, if that makes sense. So I don't know if you've heard of Westboro Baptist Church in the States. They have these God hates fags signs and placards.
Oh, we've got something similar here.
People point to that rightly and condemn it, and we should too. But often people will say that's Christian extremism. And I want to say it isn't, because what they're being extreme about is not Christian. If such a thing as Christian extremism exists, it would be a good thing. It would be great if there were people who were extreme about loving their neighbour and caring for the poor and doing good to others. So I think where we see parts of the Christian world behaving badly, we need to say they're being like that because they're not following Jesus at this point, rather than because they are. It's because they're being unchristian, not because they're being too Christian.
Okay. What are your thoughts on children as young as 12 and younger with parents' consent on living as a girl but born a boy and later gender reassignment? So that's actually happened with some people. They've had friends who have had that happen to them.
That is a huge issue, and it would be worthy of a whole evening just on that, because there's a lot to think about. There's a book coming out, I think this week, by an American friend of mine called Andrew Walker, and it's called God and the Transgender Debate. It's the best thing I've read on the issue. It's accessible, it's not technical, but he's someone who's done a lot of research and thought on it. So if you want a proper answer to that, read his book.
Can you just repeat that again?
God and the Transgender Debate by Andrew Walker. What I would say is that one of the things one of the statistics that is out there and the research that's been done into gender dysphoria is that in the majority of cases, and I think it's even the vast majority of cases, when young children experience gender dysphoria, in the vast majority of cases, they cease to experience that by the time they've gone through puberty. And therefore, I just don't think it's going to help young kids to immediately swoop in with puberty blockers and all the rest of it, when the issue may actually likely resolve itself later on in adolescence. I think I also want to say that the Bible shows us that our bodies are not arbitrary. Actually, our bodies are not accidental. We don't believe that we've just randomly ended up with the flesh that we're carrying around. But actually, in the Bible, our body is both a gift and a calling. We live in a fallen world, so it may not be the gift and the calling we would have chosen. And again, the gospel puts us all in the same boat. All of us experience some kind of bodily brokenness. Some of us have got long-term health issues. Some of us really struggle with body image issues. And there are people who struggle with dysphoria of feeling like they're in the wrong body. But we know the answer to our bodily brokenness is not going to be found in what we can try to do to our body. The answer to our bodily brokenness is only going to be found in the ultimate bodily brokenness of Jesus. That was the ultimate affliction when he died on a cross. That was the ultimate body image issue. We're told people couldn't bear to look at him when he hung on a cross. That's the ultimate shame. And if I can put it this way, Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate dysphoria. Because he who had no sin was made to be sin for us. That is the ultimate being in the wrong flesh. And so the answer to our dysphoria is not trying to undo what we think has gone wrong with our body. Actually, the answer to our dysphoria is for our body to be redeemed through Jesus and what he's done. And one of the most tragic aspects of this whole discussion is that among those who have gone through some kind of transition process, the rates of severe mental health problems and of suicide are 19 times higher than in normal life, in the general population rather. And as Christians, that should trouble us deeply. And my suspicion is, if you've spent so much of your life thinking, this is the thing that makes me not right, and therefore when I fix it, then I will finally feel liberated and free and truly myself for the first time, and you go through this long, painful, invasive procedure, and at the other end of it, you're not feeling authentic and liberated and free, you're not back at square one, you're somewhere far worse, because now you don't have hope. And so actually, because we believe in a fallen and broken world, we should be the most compassionate people. Because we should be the people who most understand why someone can feel that way. And even if as a Christian, I think a lot of the thinking is very, very wrong-headed, the pain is very real. And we need to be those who can come alongside. Our churches should feel like they're the places where it's safest to talk about these feelings and for people who have these experiences to be able to share them. But our job is to again show people.
Was that your experience in church?
With sexuality, yes. Sadly, it's not always the case, but yeah, thankfully in the churches I've been at and where I've been open, I was never made to feel disgusting or a freak, because actually the gospel always levels the ground, doesn't it? It's always a level playing field. I was sharing once I was doing a workshop for a group of pastors back in the UK, and one pastor just said in the middle of this workshop, how can you talk to a gay person and not be disgusted by them? And I remember kind of slightly reeling from the shock of the force of the question. But my reflex was to say to him, by being more disgusted by your own sin. Because Paul could say in 1 Timothy 1, I think it is, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. And it wasn't that Paul had done an extensive survey of the first century Christian church and discovered, oh, as it turns out, I actually am the worst. Someone had to be, it turns out it's me. No, Paul is showing us that when you know your own heart, you can't really believe there's someone else out there who's more messed up than you are. And if that is what the gospel does to us, it should make our churches actually really non-judgmental. Because whatever someone else comes out with or confesses or admits to, we're thinking, do you know what? I'm no better.